Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve with your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend Newport West for securing this very important debate. It is also, might I add, a pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Llanelli, who I thought made several important points regarding the situation we currently find ourselves, most notably the fact that this is very much the product of several failings over many years. And I also thank her for reference to some of the issues that rural communities face with regards to the fuel and energy crises, something that I want to focus on actually in my speech this afternoon. But of course, we've had a few opportunities in recent months to debate the impact of the rising costs of living on households and our communities. But I'm very grateful to my honourable friend from Newport West for securing this debate today to kind of focus on the impact it is having in Wales. As has already been mentioned, the recent increases to the price cap in April, rising by some 54%, has already caused a lot of concern and misery for households across Wales. And I note that as we debate today, the speculation that the cap might rise again in a few months' time to over £3,000, with further increases expected when it's reviewed in January of next year. It coincides, of course, at a time when inflation has soared to a 30-year high, and the UK is facing the biggest fall in living standards since records began. It's quite sobering to reflect on the fact that following the April price cap review, the Welsh Government found that some 45% of households in Wales would fall into real fuel poverty. And I shudder to think what that will mean, or what the situation would be rather in the autumn, both when the further increases to the price cap come in, and also, of course, when the demand for fuel and heating also increases in the winter months. But I think it's worth repeating a few of the statistics, just to set a little bit of the background to how severe this crisis is. Domestic gas prices have increased by 95% between May 2021 and May 2022, and domestic electricity prices, as we've already heard, rose in that time by some 54%. Now, in nominal terms, last April's price cap saw an increase in the maximum for average bills from £1,277 a year to £1,971. Now, just in this last May, the Chief Executive of Ofgem mentioned that he expected the price cap to rise by a further 40% in the autumn to a figure of around £2,800. But perhaps demonstrating just how volatile the situation is and how unpredictable, perhaps, analysts now suggest that rather than £2,800, the price cap in the autumn will actually surpass £3,000. Now, if that were to happen, it would mean more than doubling in the last 2 years. And that's why I think it is really important that we discuss today the sufficiency of the measures that the government has brought forward to date. Now, as the Honourable Member for Llanelli mentioned, the price cap, insofar as it offers any solace to households, it only offers a solace to those households who are connected to the mains gas grid. And as representing Ceredigion, sadly, I know that some 72% of properties in my constituency are not connected to the mains gas grid. We have that an enviable accolade of being the UK constituency that is most dependent on heating oil for domestic heating. And as has already been mentioned this afternoon, the prices for off-grid heating oil and also gas is not regulated by Ofgem, and so the prices have increased to astronomical levels. Indeed, 150% increase to heating oil on average in the last year, and some 250% increase over the last 2 years. Without wanting to labour the point, rural households have particular challenges when it comes to dealing with the challenge of heating their homes. Some are structural, and ones that I'd like us to pursue, and the government actually to address before the autumn. Standing charges, for example. Wales is particularly badly served in typical standing charges. In April 2022, the cap for South Wales, for the daily cap, rose by 94%. It rose 102% for North Wales, to a daily rate of 46 pence. Now, daily rates for my constituency in Ceredigion after April are on average about 50% higher than those levied in London. It doesn't matter how much they use, it doesn't matter if they save, that is the daily standing rate. So it is a particular challenge then when we consider most of the housing stock in my constituency performs very badly when it comes to the energy performance certificates. Indeed, some 36% of homes in Ceredigion reach an EPC rating of C or above. Now, it's not perhaps surprising that we do so badly when we then consider that 35% of our homes were actually constructed in the 19th century. I mean, it is quite staggering, but the vast majority of our housing stock, of the housing stock that will exist in 2050, has already been built, and over a third will have been built in the Victorian age. Now, the reason why I draw attention to this point is that when we talk about energy efficiency measures, off-grid homes and old homes are particularly difficult to bring up to standard. Bayes has estimated that 20% of off-gas grid homes are technically unsuitable for low-temperature heat pumps, one of the major policies of this government. And furthermore, the Heat and Building Strategy assessment has suggested that the average cost to retrofit an off-gas grid home is around £12,000, but if you include insulation, which you really need to, you can add a further £2,000. Now, that is the sort of average figures quoted in the Heat and Building Strategy. But a lot of analysts suggest that for certain rural off-grid homes, the cost could be a lot higher. And yet at the moment, we don't see enough, in my opinion, from the government of support for these households in order to make these very important interventions to help make their homes more energy efficient. And the further point I would add is that typically, but not always, but typically you find that a lot of these off-grid homes are in rural areas, and in rural areas there tends to be lower salaries. Certainly in Ceredigion, that is the case. So we are hit in many different aspects with challenges that we can't really overcome without some government support. Now, just to sort of summarise the challenges that many of my constituents are facing at the moment and the severity again of the situation, many have contacted me in recent weeks to say how they are taking quite extraordinary measures to try and keep their energy bills down. I've been told that people turning the boiler off so that they can have to save a little bit on that, having cold showers. I've been told of people turning the freezers off, avoiding meals that need to be cooked in the oven to save on electricity. I don't think I need to point out to honourable members that that means they'll need then to use more of a microwave and typically less healthy meals, so there's a knock-on impact on that. But the most striking one I found was a family telling me that they'd bought solar-powered garden lights so that they can use them for indoor lighting in the evening. Such was their concern about the electricity bill. Of course, it's not just households that are being impacted by these cost of living raises. I know of households, of businesses, and community organisations were struggling, whether it is to keep swimming lessons going on in the community swimming pool. One hospitality business has quoted his energy bills have gone up by 450% in the last 18 months. Sadly, they are having to consider very difficult decisions of whether or not they can continue to operate and stay in business. But I'd like to finish, Ms Knox, by referring to another problem that we're facing in Wales, but also in rural Wales, and that is the cost of fuel. We know that Wales is the most car-dependent nation of the UK, with some 83% of journeys being taken by private car as opposed to other means of transport. Now, I would very much like a situation in the near future where we do have public transport infrastructure in rural Wales and in Ceredigion. That means we don't have to depend on the car. But at the moment, many of my constituents simply do not have the choice. And I'd like to make the point here on record that we're not talking, as is sometimes suggested by colleagues elsewhere in the UK, not in Wales, I should add, the car journeys are somehow a luxury. You know, that is not the case. These are car journeys to go to work, to access services, to access healthcare, unavoidable journeys. And due to a lack of alternative options, they are very, very vulnerable to the price increases, petrol and diesel. I draw attention to one of the impact that it also has on public services. If we think of carers and district nurses, it is true across Wales, but in rural areas, carers have come to me and explained that they will typically drive anything between 400 and 600 miles a week just in order to care for the residents that they have on their rota. And yet they are still now having to pay astronomical prices at the pumps. And I have been in conversation with the previous Minister in the Treasury about the possibility of extending the rural fuel duty relief scheme to parts of Wales. Because as I can see it, areas such as Ceredigion satisfy all of the criteria, barring the fact that we fall within 100 miles of a refinery. And yet, as the Competition and Markets Authority review that was announced a few weeks ago found, there's no real link to higher fuel prices at the pumps to the proximity to the refineries. Actually, the major drivers are to do with competition, the level of sales, or the volumes of sales rather, and also the models of the garages locally. So I do think that we need to look at extending the rural fuel duty relief scheme to areas like Ceredigion, so that, if nothing else, we have a bit of consistency. So I don't have a situation where the prices in Aberystwyth are some 4 or 5 pence difference to the prices in Cardigan in the south. That is a cause of considerable frustration, I can tell you. But what about some solutions? We've already heard, of course, about the government's £400 payment to households. Now, I would ask the question, is that still sufficient? Given the changes to the onward forecast for the energy price cap, is that enough? But particular questions I'd like to put to the Minister, and I'd be grateful if he were able to address them in summing up. We still are unsure whether or not the £400 energy rebate will apply to those living in park homes and indeed those on farms that perhaps don't have a domestic electricity contract. I know it's something that the government is looking at, but I would really impress upon them the urgent need to clarify these aspects. And short-term measures, because I won't go into the long-term, I do think we need to look again at restoring the £20 uplift universal credit, to remove the 2-child limit, and to increase social security in line with more recent inflation figures, all of which are recommendations that made by the Select Committee on Welsh Affairs in a recent report. I would also like to see the government increase the eligibility of those who can claim carers allowance to better reflect the true number of people providing vital care. And perhaps most boldly, if, as has been reported, we are seeing energy price caps of exceeding £3,000, I do think the government now needs to consider whether it needs to intervene more directly to limit price rises, as other governments of Europe have done. Because, in closing, Ms Knox, I have to say that constituents across Ceredigion simply cannot afford any further dithering or delay.